They marched into captivity with heads held high, carrying not just their uniforms and wounds, but the heavy armor of belief. For years, German soldiers had been told that America was no real threat, a soft nation of jazz, movies, and chewing gum. Nazi propaganda painted Americans as spoiled children of wealth, weak men who lacked discipline, and a people too fractured by immigrants and races to fight with unity. This image was not just whispered in barracks, it was shouted from radios, splashed across newspapers, and repeated by officers until it hardened into certainty. To many German soldiers, the United States existed in half fantasy, a land of cars and gadgets but without real strength. They were said to have comfort but no courage, money but no will to sacrifice. German propaganda insisted that Americans would crumble under pressure, unable to endure the harshness of war. And so the men captured in Africa, in France, or after failed offensives carried these convictions with them as if they were facts. For the average German POW, the very idea of being shipped across the ocean to America stirred little fear. They believed they were being sent to a nation of consumer pleasures and moral weakness, a place that might feed them decently, but could never command their respect. To them, the real enemies were Britain's stubborn resolve and Russia's vast manpower. America, they thought, was just an arsenal without warriors. And so, when those first train doors opened and German prisoners looked out at a land they had only seen through caricature, they expected indulgence, laziness, and disorganization. They did not yet know that this illusion, carefully built by propaganda, was about to crumble in the face of something far more shocking than they had ever imagined. That early confidence was not built on words alone. It was carved into the memories of men who had marched through Europe with stunning speed. In France, German divisions had swept aside armies thought to be stronger and better prepared. Paris fell in weeks, not years. To many officers, this confirmed the idea that Germany's discipline and ruthlessness could overcome nations that valued comfort over sacrifice. In the Balkans, victories came just as swiftly. The Wehrmacht rolled across rugged terrain, toppling governments and scattering resistance. Each conquest was another stone laid in the foundation of German certainty. The message was repeated endlessly. No enemy could withstand the precision and speed of German arms. North Africa added to that sense of superiority. The Afrika Korps under Rommel became legendary, pushing deep into deserts where supplies should have faltered but did not. Soldiers told themselves that if they could outfight the British in scorching sands, there was little the Americans, supposedly soft, inexperienced, and indulgent, could offer in resistance. For the men who would one day find themselves prisoners of war, these victories were more than campaigns. They were proof that Germany's discipline triumphed over chaos, that their sacrifices outweighed the comforts of other nations, and that destiny itself seemed to favor the right. By the time American soldiers entered the war, most Germans already believed they knew how the story would end. America, in their minds, would simply be another nation added to the growing list of defeated opponents. They could not have imagined how quickly those assumptions would unravel. When the German prisoners were first loaded onto trains bound for their new life in America, they braced themselves for hardship. In their minds, captivity meant cold wooden benches, iron bars, and harsh guards. That was how they themselves had treated captured enemies, and they expected nothing less in return. Yet what awaited them was so far from expectation that many could only sit in stunned silence. Instead of cattle cars or bare compartments, they found padded seats, wide enough to sit without pressing shoulder to shoulder. The carriages had windows, clean glass, not barred slits. Light poured in, illuminating upholstery that looked more suited to tourists than to captured soldiers. And then came the greatest surprise: dining cars. Prisoners were led past white tablecloths, steaming plates, and staff who served them as if they were paying passengers instead of defeated enemies. The clatter of cutlery, the smell of coffee, the presence of menus. It was all disorienting. Some Germans whispered among themselves, suspicious that it might be a trick, a brief show before harsher treatment. Others stared out the windows, trying to make sense of the contradiction before their eyes. Even their guards seemed relaxed, not the snarling conquerors they had been prepared to face. It was, in truth, a small glimpse of how ordinary Americans lived and traveled, but for the prisoners it was a revelation. If this was transport for enemy soldiers, what must life be like for free citizens? That simple question began to gnaw at the edges of everything they had been told. As the trains rolled deeper into the American heartland, another shock awaited the German prisoners, one that came not from the seats they sat on or the meals they had eaten, but from the windows themselves. Night fell, and instead of darkness, the landscape glowed. Town after town shimmered in light. Rows of houses were illuminated as if each one held a celebration. Street lamps stretched in perfect lines, their glow uninterrupted. Factories beamed with activity even at midnight, their smokestacks cutting into the night sky. In Germany, blackouts had become a way of life. Cities dimmed their lights, shrouded in fear of bombers. Families gathered around weak lanterns or candles, their homes cloaked in gloom. Even in the capital, darkness was a shield of survival. Here in America there was no such fear. Electric bulbs burned without hesitation. Neon signs flickered outside diners. Theaters cast light onto crowded sidewalks, and trains passed stations that looked as bright as day. The sheer waste of electricity, as it seemed to the prisoners, was staggering. How could a nation shine so brightly and still have resources to fight a war on two fronts? For many it was an unsettling sight. The glow of America's towns was more than comfort. It was confidence. Light spoke of safety, of abundance, of a country untouched by devastation. It was proof that America was not a weak, decadent nation barely scraping by, but a giant whose resources seemed endless. The prisoners watched silently, each lighted street pressing against the walls of propaganda they had carried with them. For the first time they realized perhaps the war had already been decided, and Germany simply had not accepted it yet. When the German prisoners heard the first accounts of Liberty ships, they assumed it was exaggeration, a trick of Allied propaganda. No one could build an ocean-going vessel in less than a year, let alone in a matter of weeks. Yet as they saw the factories and shipyards for themselves, disbelief gave way to stunned realization. America was doing exactly that. At sprawling yards along the coasts, steel skeletons rose in neat rows, each one destined to become a ship capable of carrying supplies, tanks, or men across the Atlantic. The scale alone was overwhelming. Dozens of hulls under construction at the same time, cranes swinging overhead like mechanical giants, and welders working in sparks of light that never ceased. But it was the speed that shattered all illusions. Workers spoke of new records with casual pride. A ship finished in 40 days. Another in just over 2 weeks. One even launched in a little more than 4 days, completed so quickly that Germans who heard the figure laughed in disbelief until they saw newspaper clippings, and American guards who treated it as a normal fact. In Germany, naval construction was a laborious process, each ship representing years of planning and scarce resources. To hear that Americans built so many so fast, and treated them almost as disposable, was crushing. It revealed not just industry but an ability to adapt, to turn production into a weapon more powerful than any gun. For the prisoners, the Liberty ships were a turning point. If America could launch a fleet in the time it took Germany to lay a keel, what hope was left? Each vessel sliding into the water was not just steel and rivets, but a symbol of a nation's overwhelming strength, and of Germany's impending defeat. If the speed of shipbuilding had stunned the prisoners, the ports themselves delivered the final blow to their sense of scale. As they arrived at America's massive harbors, their eyes widened at scenes that seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Towering cranes moved effortlessly, lifting cargo containers and steel beams with precision. Docks stretched for miles, lined with vessels waiting to be loaded or unloaded. Endless warehouses overflowed with supplies, crates of food, mountains of coal, barrels of oil, rows of vehicles still smelling of fresh paint. Everything moved with a rhythm that felt almost mechanical, as if the entire harbor were a living machine. Trains rumbled in and out of the ports day and night, carrying steel from inland mills, wheat from Kansas fields, and oil from Texas wells. Trucks rolled in endless convoys, engines humming in unison. The sheer coordination was staggering. One port alone seemed to surpass the entire German supply system. For officers who had once prided themselves on the efficiency of the Reich, the sight was devastating. Germany had spent years struggling to get fuel to the front, to supply men with boots and rifles, to keep planes in the air. Yet here was a nation that seemed to move supplies without effort, as if abundance itself had been turned into a weapon. The prisoners realized that Germany was not simply fighting an enemy army, but an entire industrial civilization, one whose capacity dwarfed their own to the point of hopelessness. Among the many shocks awaiting the German prisoners, none was as strangely disarming as the moment they were handed sticks of chewing gum. At first they thought it was some kind of mistake, perhaps medicine wrapped in colorful paper. Gum was nearly unheard of in Europe at the time, a novelty reserved for children in rare city shops before the war, and certainly never seen in the hands of soldiers. The guards offered it casually, with the same indifference one might give away a match or a cigarette. "Here, take some," they would say, passing out sticks in silver or green wrappers. The prisoners hesitated, unwrapping the strange gift slowly, sniffing its sugary scent, uncertain whether it was meant as a joke. Then came the first taste, sweet, refreshing, and unlike anything they had known. For men accustomed to black bread that crumbled in their hands and watery cabbage soup, the sensation was overwhelming. They chewed cautiously at first, surprised that the flavor lingered rather than disappearing instantly. Some spat it out, thinking it was food gone wrong. Others laughed nervously, only to realize the guards were chewing the same thing without a thought. Before long the camp echoed with the sound of jaws moving in rhythm, Germans whispering to one another about the odd American habit. It was such a small gesture, yet it carried weight far beyond its size. To the prisoners, chewing gum was not just a treat, it was a symbol. It proved that America's abundance was so vast that even prisoners could waste sweetness on something that wasn't swallowed. In that moment, disbelief turned into a strange kind of awe. The gum was simple, but its message was undeniable. America had more than enough. For the German prisoners, chewing gum quickly became more than a curiosity. It was a revelation. In Germany before and during the war, gum was virtually unknown. A handful of wealthier children in Berlin or Hamburg might have seen it once in foreign shops, but to ordinary soldiers it was exotic, something that belonged to another world. Sweetness itself had become a luxury. Sugar was rationed, chocolate was rare, and even bread was stretched with sawdust or ground-up acorns. To think that a society could waste sugar and flavoring on something not even swallowed bordered on insanity. Yet in the United States, guards handed it out as casually as cigarettes or matches. Boxes of gum sat in supply rooms, refilled without worry, as though the supply was endless. To the POWs, this generosity revealed something far deeper than kindness. It spoke of resources so immense that luxuries were treated as everyday items. They marveled at the idea that American children chewed gum daily, while in Germany mothers struggled to find enough food to keep their children alive. Conversations spread across the camp. Some prisoners joked that America must be hiding mountains of sugar somewhere. Others quietly admitted the truth. This small stick of gum shattered years of propaganda. The Reich had painted Americans as weak, soft, and yet here was proof of confidence. A nation so secure it could give its prisoners pleasures that German generals couldn't offer their own troops. Chewing gum in its simplicity became a symbol of America's surplus. It told the Germans that the war was not just about armies and weapons, it was about a way of life, one fueled by abundance they could no longer deny. Over time, chewing gum in the camps ceased to be just a novelty. To the German POWs it grew into a powerful symbol of America's casual wealth. Each brightly wrapped stick carried a meaning far beyond its sweetness. It was proof that in America, luxuries were not reserved for the privileged or rationed for the elite. They were scattered like leaves in autumn, available to anyone, even to captives. In Germany, scarcity defined daily life. Every meal was counted, every ration weighed, every indulgence closely monitored. Even before the war tightened its grip, luxuries like sweets or imported items were rare. By the later years they were unthinkable. Soldiers returning from the front could expect only watered-down beer, black bread stretched with fillers, and perhaps a bit of sausage if they were fortunate. Against this backdrop, the sight of chewing gum being handed out in bundles felt surreal. What shocked the POWs most was the casualness of it all. American guards chewed gum without ceremony, blowing bubbles, tossing wrappers aside, offering sticks to one another as if it meant nothing. That indifference revealed a society so wealthy that it did not even notice its luxury. To the Germans who had been taught that only hard struggle could maintain a nation's strength, this was deeply unsettling. The gum became a topic of evening debates in the barracks. Some prisoners insisted it proved the wastefulness of democracy. Others argued it revealed a deeper kind of strength, the confidence of a people who did not fear running out. Slowly, admiration began to creep into their voice. If such small luxuries could be given away so freely, what other resources lay behind America's war effort? To them, a single stick of gum had become more persuasive than any propaganda leaflet. Before long, chewing gum in the camps became more than a symbol. It became a kind of currency. In a place where money meant little, a stick of gum could open doors. Prisoners traded it for extra bread, for a turn with a borrowed book, even for help with chores. A guard offering gum could instantly soften resistance, while a fellow prisoner who shared his peace gained instant respect. The trading was not only about material value but about human connection. Sharing gum was a gesture of friendship, a way to bridge the gap between men from different units, towns, or even political leanings. It was small, but it broke down barriers. One POW later recalled that a single stick, offered during a moment of homesickness, meant more to him than a full meal, because it carried kindness along with its sweetness. Guards noticed too. Many Americans would casually hand out gum from their own rations, not realizing the ripple effect it created inside the wire. To the prisoners, this generosity was almost unthinkable. In Germany, luxuries were hoarded, reserved for the privileged few. Here they were tossed across the yard with a grin, transforming an ordinary day into something remarkable. The gum's role as camp currency revealed more than economic improvisation. It demonstrated how abundance created trust, how sharing built bonds, and how even a trivial item could shift morale. In the end, what mattered was not the gum itself, but what it represented. A society so confident in its strength that it could afford to be generous, even to its enemies. When German prisoners were assigned to work details in American towns and factories, the first thing they noticed was not the machines or the scale of production, but the lives of ordinary workers. It was in the small details that the greatest shocks emerged. Men and women arriving for shifts parked their own cars outside, not officers' cars or government vehicles, but private automobiles owned by everyday families. For German soldiers who had seen even high-ranking officers struggle to secure fuel for staff cars, this sight was baffling. Then came the boots. American laborers walked confidently in sturdy leather footwear, often new, with pairs at home to spare. By contrast, German soldiers at the front had worn patched boots until the soles gave way, while civilians back home queued for hours to repair shoes that were already years old. The fact that factory workers in America, not aristocrats or generals, had such reliable basics was a revelation. Lunch breaks deepened the sense of contrast. From brown paper bags came sandwiches stacked with meat, apples polished bright, and thermoses filled with coffee. Some even carried chocolate bars or pieces of fruit so fresh they seemed extravagant. German prisoners who had marched through occupied Europe surviving on thin rations stared in disbelief. To them, this was not just food, it was wealth made edible. The message sank in quietly but powerfully. If the average worker could live like this in the middle of a global war, what must American leaders and soldiers enjoy? For the prisoners, these everyday details spoke louder than speeches. They revealed a society not merely surviving but thriving, one where prosperity was ordinary and scarcity was almost unthinkable. The longer the prisoners lived among American communities, the harder it became to ignore a staggering truth. Ordinary American workers lived in greater comfort than the elites of Germany. This realization was not born from statistics or speeches, but from daily observation. A factory hand might drive home in his own car, park outside a modest but spacious house with running water, electricity and heating, then sit down with his family to eat a meal richer than anything a German officer could expect at the front.
For men who had grown up in a rigid class system, where privilege was concentrated at the top and the rest endured scarcity, this was difficult to accept. A colonel in Germany might enjoy wine, fine uniforms, and the loyalty of subordinates, yet his family often rationed sugar and butter just like everyone else. Here in America, sugar bowls sat casually on kitchen tables, milk was delivered to doorsteps, and children chewed candy without giving it a second thought. The contrast was especially bitter when prisoners thought of German propaganda that had promised superiority. They had believed themselves part of a chosen people destined to inherit abundance, yet in captivity they saw that American mechanics, welders and farmhands already lived in the abundance they were told only conquest could bring. This quiet recognition struck deeper than battlefield defeat. It exposed the lie at the heart of Nazi ideology, that discipline and racial purity alone could build strength. The truth, unfolding before their eyes, was that democracy,
diversity, and economic freedom, had built a society where comfort was not the privilege of the few, but the standard for the many. And for the prisoners, this realization was as humbling as it was inescapable. The first time the prisoners were taken to work assignments near the massive factories, they prepared themselves to confirm what Nazi propaganda had always told them, that American society was weak, disorganized, and fractured. Yet what they saw with their own eyes shattered those beliefs instantly. On assembly lines stretching farther than they could follow, women in overalls guided cranes, operated welding torches, and inspected engines with the practiced precision of seasoned professionals. Nearby, African American workers managed complex machinery, driving forklifts and supervising production lines with authority. For German soldiers raised under a regime that dismissed women as weak and minorities as inferior, the sight was disorienting. Here were groups that Nazi ideology claimed could never contribute meaningfully to an advanced society, yet they were running the machinery that produced the tanks, planes, and ships overwhelming Germany on every front. And it was not just token effort, production never slowed. 3 shifts rotated day and night, an endless rhythm of sparks, steel, and motion. One prisoner wrote later that he had expected chaos if such workers were entrusted with critical tasks, but what he saw was discipline and competence surpassing anything he had encountered in German factories. The propaganda he had swallowed for years collapsed in front of him. If those who were dismissed as weak by his government could build an unstoppable arsenal, what did that say about the true strength of America and the falsehood of Nazi claims? The psychological blow was immense. Defeat on the battlefield could be explained by numbers or strategy, but this was different. This was ideological collapse. The prisoners could no longer believe in the racial myths drilled into them since childhood. Reality, in the clang of hammers and the hiss of welding torches, had shattered illusion. If the workers themselves had unsettled the Germans, the sheer scale of the factories delivered the final crushing blow. At one steel plant, towering smokestacks poured fire into the sky day and night, the roar of blast furnaces never ceasing. Prisoners stood on catwalks and watched molten rivers of steel flow into molds, a sight that dwarfed every industrial memory they carried from home. Some whispered that a single day's output here matched the entire monthly capacity of a German province. In Ohio, they toured a plant that produced 10,000 tons of steel daily. The numbers seemed impossible, but the evidence lay in the endless lines of freight cars bringing ore and coal, and in the mountains of finished beams waiting to be shipped. One prisoner admitted later that the factory wasted more steel in spillage than his unit could ever hope to see in raw supply. That casual surplus, treated almost carelessly, stunned men who had watched German soldiers patch boots with scraps and recycle every nail. Even more overwhelming were the shipyards. In New Orleans, they saw Liberty ships slide into the water at a rate of 1 every few days. One yard alone produced more vessels in a month than the entire Kriegsmarine could in a year. The prisoners realized that their nation's carefully hoarded resources were meaningless against such abundance. The conclusion was unavoidable. Germany was not merely outnumbered or outmaneuvered, it was outproduced on a scale beyond imagination. Entire regions of their homeland were eclipsed by a single American factory. The myth of German industrial supremacy was gone forever. For many German prisoners, the final fracture in their pride did not come from machines or statistics, but from something far more human: waste. In the camps, they watched American guards finish a meal, take only a few drags from a cigarette, and then toss both aside without a second thought. Half-eaten sandwiches lay discarded on benches and glowing cigarettes smoldered in the. To the prisoners still haunted by years of rationing and shortages, such scenes were unbearable. Back home, German families stood in breadlines and ration cards were guarded like gold. Tobacco was so scarce that soldiers rolled leaves or reused butts until they crumbled. Even officers prized a single cigarette as a luxury to be savored. Yet here in America, the same items were treated as disposable. Prisoners could not understand how a nation could be so wealthy that it could throw away what Germany struggled desperately to provide even its most loyal troops. Some described feeling humiliation rather than anger. They had been told that America was weak, indulgent, and lacking in discipline, but what they saw was different. Waste did not signify weakness, it revealed such depth of abundance that the loss of a cigarette or slice of bread meant nothing. For men who had starved on the Eastern Front or watched comrades fight over crumbs, It was devastating proof that they had entered a world operating on entirely different terms. In the quiet moments after meals, many prisoners admitted that this casual plenty broke them more deeply than any battlefield defeat. They could fight courage with courage, but they could not fight against a society so wealthy it could waste what they had never truly possessed. If the sight of waste wounded German pride, the experience of Christmas in captivity touched something far deeper. In many camps, December brought not stricter rations or harsher treatment, but unexpected gestures of kindness. Local communities, church groups, and even school children contributed to holiday meals for the prisoners. The result was feasts that seemed almost impossible for men who had come from a starving continent. Tables were set with roasted turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, pies, and even small treats like cookies and candies. For prisoners who had not tasted such abundance in years, the first bite felt unreal. Some wept quietly, overwhelmed not only by the food itself, but by the thought that it was offered to enemies. The guards explained that this was not propaganda, not an exception, but simply how Americans celebrated Christmas. Every family across the country was sharing something similar, and the prisoners were invited to partake. Local choirs sometimes sang carols outside the camps, their voices carrying through the winter air. Children sent small cards wishing the enemy soldiers a Merry Christmas. For many prisoners hardened by years of war, these gestures cut deeper than defeat. They had been told that Americans were selfish and cruel, yet here was a generosity that defied ideology. One officer later wrote that the Christmas feast destroyed what remained of his belief in Nazi propaganda. Food could be explained by production, but kindness could not be faked. It revealed a nation so confident in its strength that it could treat captives with dignity and warmth. For many German POWs, that holiday was the moment when the war ended, not only on the battlefield, but in their heart. The breaking point for many German prisoners came not through meals or luxuries, but through the sheer scale of war that America unleashed in June 9. Within days of the Normandy landings, newsreels and photographs began circulating through the camp. The guards did not hide them. Instead, they gathered prisoners to watch the invasion unfold on screen. What they saw defied belief. First came the endless columns of ships. 6,000 vessels crowded the English Channel, forming an armada larger than anything the German Navy had ever imagined. To men who had served on supply-starved fronts, the sight of such massed power was staggering. Landing craft streamed toward the beaches in endless waves, each one carrying men, tanks and supplies as though the sea itself had been turned into a highway. Then came the aircraft, thousands of them, darkening the sky. Bombers, fighters, gliders and transports all moving in a synchronized display of coordination that no German propaganda could dismiss. Prisoners whispered to each other that this was not a battle, but an avalanche, a storm that no human will could withstand. Most devastating of all was the logistics. The films showed artificial harbors being constructed in mere days, pipelines laid under the sea, and trucks pouring ashore by the tens of thousands. The prisoners knew enough of warfare to understand what this meant, a force that could not be stopped. Courage, discipline, or even fanaticism could not hold against factories that built liberty ships in days and fed entire armies across oceans. For one German colonel, the conclusion was immediate. He admitted to fellow officers that the war was lost. Not someday, not perhaps. It was already decided. Watching the D-Day invasion, the illusion of victory finally collapsed. If the scale of D-Day crushed the German prisoners' faith in military victory, the next revelation shattered their sense of moral purpose. Soon after the invasion, Allied forces began liberating concentration camps, and the evidence made its way into the POW compounds. At first, many refused to believe what they were shown. Years of propaganda had taught them that reports of atrocities were enemy lies. But then came the photographs, the eyewitness accounts, and eventually letters from home confirming the truth. The films revealed skeletal survivors stumbling out of barbed wire enclosures, mass graves uncovered by bulldozers, and children reduced to shadows of light. American guards did not gloat or lecture, they simply presented the evidence and let it speak for itself. The silence in the camp theaters was heavier than any bombardment. Hardened officers who had endured years of battle sat with their heads in their hands, unable to reconcile the images with the cause they had sworn to serve. For many, the realization was devastating. It was no longer about losing a war, it was about discovering that everything they had fought for had been poisoned at its core.
The supposed mission to defend civilization was revealed as barbarism of the worst kind. Prisoners later admitted that this moment broke them in ways defeat on the battlefield never could. Military collapse was one thing, moral collapse was far deeper. From that day forward, they knew the Reich was not just doomed, it was damned. When the war finally ended and the long journey home began, thousands of German prisoners carried more than just their uniforms and meager belongings. They carried memories, vivid impressions of a world so different from their own. Among those memories, strangely enough, chewing gum stood out. It was not simply the taste, though that first bite had been unforgettable for many. It was what the gum represented: casual generosity, effortless abundance, and a culture confident enough to share its luxuries even with its enemies. As trains and ships ferried the men back across the Atlantic, stories of gum circulated endlessly. One man told of American guards casually tossing packs into work details as if it were nothing. Another remembered trading sticks for extra bread or a warm coat. For many it became a symbol of their time in captivity, an item so simple, yet so profoundly different from the deprivation of Germany. When these men reached their homes, often bombed-out cities and hungry villages, they carried sticks of gum in their pockets like treasure. They gave them to children, who chewed wide-eyed, not even knowing what it was at first. Families gathered around, astonished that their fathers or brothers had received such things as prisoners. The gum became proof that the America they had been told was weak and corrupt was in fact powerful, generous and overflowing with resources. In kitchens and parlors across post-war Germany, the story repeated itself. They even gave us chewing gum. It was a line that carried disbelief, gratitude, and the quiet beginning of respect for a former enemy. Over time, chewing gum came to symbolize far more than a sweet distraction. To the former prisoners who returned to Germany, it represented the hidden strength of democracy, a strength rooted not in fear or control, but in the quiet ability to provide comfort even in the midst of war. The abundance of such small luxuries revealed a truth the Nazis had concealed, that America's power did not rest solely on tanks, ships or planes, but on an economic system that could produce both weapons and treats without strain. For German civilians, hearing about gum and other luxuries carried home by their sons or husbands was an awakening. These were not grand speeches or propaganda films, but tangible examples of what democracy looked like in practice. A stick of gum freely handed out said more about America's confidence than any battlefield victory could. It showed that a society secure in itself could afford kindness, even toward its captive. Historians later remarked that such gestures, seemingly trivial, carried immense weight in shaping post-war perceptions. Chewing gum, Coca-Cola, ice cream, even the casual waste of food, these became enduring symbols of a civilization where prosperity was normal, not a privilege. For many returning POWs, these impressions were seeds that helped reshape West Germany's values in the years of Reconstruction. What had once been mocked as decadence was now seen as strength. The ability to produce abundance for all, to extend dignity, even to enemies, demonstrated the moral and material foundations of democracy. In the memory of countless former POWs, chewing gum was not just a taste of something new, it was the first taste of freedom's quiet confidence.